Hi again. So I just want to give you a briefing on the main assignment for this module. So you'll find the slides that I want to go through behind this card here. So as you probably know already, there are two parts to the assessment overall. There's the lab work and there's the assignment or a project. The lab work is worth 40%. And essentially that's the Movies fan app that you've been working on in the labs themselves. So what you'll be submitting after you've completed part 4 of the series, you'll be just submitting a GitHub repo to me, and that will be worth 40%. And I'd like ideally for it to be completed by July the 17th. I'm setting that as the deadline date. Now, just before I move on to the main assignment, so as I said, you'll be submitting a GitHub repo. And as I've probably mentioned a couple of times already, it's really important that your repo will have all of the Git commits that were prescribed in the labs themselves. Essentially, what you'll be submitting to me is just a simple text file containing the URL of the repo. And you'll be doing that to Moodle, but I'll provide those details when it gets closer to the deadline date. Now, in terms of the assignment or project, which is worth 60%, there are two options that you have available to you. Most people take option 1. Option 1 is where your starting point is the Movies fan app that you've completed from the labs. So that's up to part 4, up to and including part 4. That's your starting point, and then you expand or extend the app in any way that you want to really, although I'm obviously going to give you guidelines as to the directions you might take it. And the other option is you could, if you wanted to, use the point of interest API that you developed in the full stack web module and develop a React single page app client for that. Or I suppose the third option, although I'm included in option 2 there, you may be familiar with some other open web API and you'd like to develop a React client for that. Now, most people, to be honest, go for option 1, which is, you've got a good starting point in terms of your code base. Whereas with option 2, you're kind of starting from scratch. But some people may prefer to take option 2. A very small minority would have last year and in earlier years. So you can decide for yourself which route to take. Either way, what you will be submitting to me, whether you take option 1 or 2, is again just a GitHub repo of your work. And as I keep on mentioning probably too many times, it's really, really important that you commit your work as you progress through the assignment. I would suggest that you commit every time you sit down to do some work, whether you're working on it for half an hour or an hour and a half. Commit very, very regularly and try and be as accurate as you can with the commit message associated with the commit. But in terms of deliverables, then I'm saying your GitHub repo, and also I'll ask you to make a recording of the demo of the app itself, and you'll be submitting the URL of the probably YouTube demo. But we can firm up on that stuff when it gets closer to the deadline. If I just go back again to the previous slide, the deadline I'm setting for the assignment there is August 23rd. I didn't check now whether that's on a sensible day of the week or not, but it's around that time frame anyway. Now, in terms of, so the rest of this presentation is assuming you're going to go for option 1 there, extending the Movies fan app. And before you start working on the assignment, I'm suggesting that you carry out these kind of steps here. Essentially, I want you to make a copy of the source code on your desktop and also have a separate GitHub repo where you're going to be pushing your assignment work to. So here's the steps that I think you should take. If we assume that you've been working, the name of the folder on your desktop that you've been doing the lab work is Movies app, just delete the node modules folder from the your Movies app folder. Then just make a physical copy of the Movies app folder. Let's assume we call the copy assignment. Now, if you need to, then you can reinstall the node modules back into your Movies app folder if you want to. It's not necessary. The assumption is you've completed the Movies app lab work at this stage now. But you may want to do that if you're going to continue on using Movies app as some sort of experimental base. And then, so we now have the assignment folder, and what you should do with that is bring it into VS Code. And then essentially what I want you to do is to disconnect the association between the assignment folder and the GitHub repo that you would have been pushing to when you were working on this one up here. Disconnect those two using just this command here that disconnects the URL of the GitHub repo from the assignment folder, and then create a new repo up in GitHub. And then, having created that new repo, carry out this command here inside in VS Code. What this is doing is it's connecting the new GitHub repo with the local Git repo in your assignment folder. Reinstall your node modules. Where do I say that? Reinstall your node modules, and away you go. That's your starting point. So just carry out this setup procedure, and then you're good to go. Now, I've defined 3 what I call grade bands, and really I suppose it's more a question of how much time you have to spend on the assignment as much as ability. I'm sure you've got lots of ability, but it's time allocation is the problem. So if all you're interested in is just getting something in the range of 40 to 55, which is still a good mark, then I'm indicating here what you should probably do to try and achieve that. My theme for this grade band is, you've got you can demonstrate that you've got the foundation skills associated with the particular technology that we've been looking at. And the characteristics of what you're going to develop is you're essentially going to be reusing a lot of the, if not all of the components and page structures that you have developed in the lab. You're going to be reusing those to display other information or data provided by TMDB. So the features that you will develop from a UI perspective, I'm saying you probably will develop some more list type pages. Now, by list page, I mean, for example, the homepage that we developed where we had a list of movies from the discovery endpoint. We also had the upcoming movies page. I would classify that as a list page just for the purpose of this discussion here. However, you may have a page that displays a list of actors that are stored in the TMDB database, or you may have a page that displays a list of movies that are similar to a movie, because there's a TMDB endpoint that gives you that kind of information. TMDB also gives you information on the cast associated with a movie. So that would be another example of a list page. You would just list the cast members. TMDB also has details on various TV series. So these are all examples of listing pages that you could develop using the new TMDB endpoints associated with them. There will probably also be one or more new, what I'm calling detail pages. Now, the only example of a detail page that we developed in the lab was we had a movies details page. But in a similar vein, with the exact same kind of structure, you could have an actor's detail page or a TV series detail page. By the way, I'm assuming that the list pages that you develop will have the exact same structure as the listing pages that we developed in the labs. So you'll be able to reuse a lot of that code. Also, let's honor the web and the notion of hyperlinks. Have as many hyperlinks as you can. So for example, if you are showing on a page, let's say the cast members for a movie, make sure you can navigate from a particular cast member to the actor's detail page, if you do have an actor's detail page. Or if you've got a list of similar movies to a movie, you should be able to navigate from that list of movies to the movie's detail page. It's just a normal kind of hyperlinking. In terms of routing, there should be a mixture of parameterized and static URLs in what you've developed. So an example of maybe a parameterized URL would be the page that displays the details about a particular actor. Similarly, the page that would display a list of movies that are similar to a movie, that's probably going to be a parameterized URL. Static URLs might be if, like, there is a TMDB endpoint that gives you a list of the most top-rated movies of all time. So that would be probably a static URL associated with that page. It would also be a listing page. So that's what I'd be looking for in terms of routing. By data model, I'm saying you should have at least one new entity type being handled by your code. At the moment in the labs, we have two entity types. We have the movie entity type and the review entity type. So a new entity type might be actor. That would be an obvious example. And so you will show me that you investigated the structure of an actor record returned by TMDB. So there should be at least one new entity type if you want to get into this grade band. In terms of API endpoints, obviously you will touch on some new API endpoints TMDB API endpoints that we didn't cover in the labs. I'm saying there should be 3 or more new endpoints in the code that you develop. So that if you can satisfy all of those requirements, then you're going to get at the upper level of this band here. Probably get the full 55 potentially, and you are reusing most, if not all, of the code that you already developed in the labs. So it should be okay, I think, for everybody to achieve that, I hope. If you're aiming higher, what I'm calling the very good grade band, so you were aiming for somewhere between 55 and 70. Now, I guess, you could classify yourself as a confident developer because you are going to be developing your own components more than likely, and maybe even your own, definitely your own pages with custom structure. You won't be able to reuse, or there won't be examples of a page layout that you can use from the labs. You'll have to develop your own. And so what I would see to get you into this grade band now is that, you've got some custom components and some custom page layouts that you came up with yourself using Material UI. To be more specific, what am I looking for in terms of the UI? I'm saying here, you should try and extend the filtering that's currently available. So if I flip over to the app itself, so we know when I click on this here, I get my filtering site sheet. And at the moment, I'm filtering this on the basis of title and genre. But you should add maybe one, maybe more than one, maybe 2 more properties in here that are linked to movie that allows the user to filter the list of movies that are currently being displayed on the basis of whatever two properties of movie that you pick. So it's up to you. You can just look at the information that's associated with a movie and pick two, I would suggest at least two maybe, of the properties and perform filtering on the basis of those two properties. You can just add them into the site sheet here, and then the necessary logic to carry out the actual filtering. Now, I also have sorting here, but there are no fields. So I would like you to add one or two fields that will allow the user to sort the movies that are being displayed. And you can again decide which properties of movie you would pick as your basis for sorting. It could be the title, it could be date of release, it could be sort them on the basis of language. It's completely up to you. So that's what I mean by extending the filtering and adding in sorting as a feature. Now, my fantasy movie, the idea here is that I'd like you to enable the user to create their own movie. Clearly, that's going to be a web form. Now, I don't expect you to require the user to enter all of the information about the movie. Pick a subset of the properties. The obvious ones would be movie title, the genres associated with the movie, the plot of the movie, and maybe a release date notionally for the movie. There are nice third-party date picker components that you can come across online that allow you to enter the date using a nice little calendar, pop-up calendar. And the fourth property maybe would be actors. How am I going to enable the user to add actors to the movie? Now, it's up to you really. You can come up with whatever way you want to, but in my mind, let's supposing there would be an add actor button on the web form. And when the user clicks the add actor, a list of images of actors are displayed and the actor's name, let's say, which you obviously get from TMDB. And the user could select one of the actors, just the way, similar kind of way to the way we select a movie as being a favorite. They could select an actor, and that's your way of adding an actor to your fantasy movie. Ideally, when we add the actor, it would be nice if the user could give a short explanation as to the actor's role in the movie and what their cast name is, let's say, just one or two simple properties. And the user can add other actors in a similar vein. So title, plot, release date, actors, and maybe one or two other properties if you want to. That would be sufficient as data associated with your fantasy movie. Or if you want to take it even further, you could allow the user to add multiple fantasy movies. Not all at the same time, obviously, but at any time they can add a new fantasy movie. So there's web forms involved there, and there's logic in terms of how you allow them to add actors to the movie. That's tricky, really. The other properties are fairly straightforward. They're just going to be either text boxes or drop-down menus. Genre as well, multiple genres. I guess you'd like the user to categorize their fantasy movie under multiple genres, which would be nice. So that's another feature I'd like you to have a go at. In terms of routing, I'm saying if you could just add basic authentication. By basic authentication, I mean, take the authentication logic that I gave you in the lectures. That's where we implemented protected and public routes, if you remember, as part of our routing samples. Just literally take that sample code that I gave you, lift it and plant it into your Movies app. and have certain pages protected and other pages public. So let's say the home page would be public. The upcoming movies, if you have that, would be public. The list of actors, if you have that, would be public. But the other pages, like creating your fantasy movie, that would be protected. Maybe the favorites page, favorite movies page would be protected. Just have a mixture of protected and public routes where you're requiring the user to authenticate themselves if they decide to try and navigate to one of those protected routes. And the username passwords can be stored just as a simple array. Just have an array, let's say, of 2 different users with username password combinations. And that array can be stored in memory in the browser itself as part of your JavaScript code. There's no backend service expected here. Next, I'm talking about, in terms of data model, just have caching everywhere. So I've given you a lot of code and we've developed caching code in the labs. So just make sure you're using caching in all of your new pages as well. By the way, the fantasy movie at the moment, it probably won't be, it'll only be stored in memory in the browser. It won't be stored at the back end anywhere for now anyway, if you're aiming for this grade band. So that means when you shut down the Create React App development server and restart it, all of that data is lost, but that's okay to get into this grade band. Storybook, I'm bringing Storybook in here because you're more than likely going to be developing some new components, so you should have Storybook support for those new components. So that's the very good, or 55 to 70 grade band. If you're aiming for excellence, 70 to 90, then I'm classifying this as being kind of an independent learner. So you're going to have to read up on some aspects of React, or just read blogs in general, depending on what you want to achieve. Either way, you're going to be covering stuff more than likely that has not been dealt with in the lectures or the labs, hence you have to learn them independently. And here are the ideas I'm coming up with for independent learning. Pagination, if I go back to the app. This is the homepage, and what we get from TMDB is a list of movies, but we just get 20 movies. But in fact, it has many, many more movies in its discovery endpoint. But essentially what we've asked it for is the first page from the discovery endpoint. But there are many other pages. And so what would be nice is if we had some sort of pagination hyperlinking maybe at the bottom here. And we all know how pagination should work from a user's perspective. So to get pagination working for any page that has a list of things, so this would be one obvious place here where you could put pagination. If you have the upcoming movies page, you could add pagination to that. I'll talk a little bit more about pagination at the end of this video to give you some guidance. But if you have a page that displays a list of actors, that TMDB endpoint is paginated as well. So there's lots of places where you can add in pagination. Now, there are third-party React components that you can find out on the web that will implement the UI part of pagination, and I'm fine with people using third-party components. That's the whole point of any development, really. Don't develop everything from the ground up yourselves. If there are third-party resources that you can use, then by all means use them. There are definitely third-party pagination resources available out there. And so that's one feature you could look at. You could add a playlist creation feature to allow the user to create their own playlist of movies. So if the user, and it's multiple now, multiple playlists. Now, selecting favorites in a way was a little bit like creating a playlist, but we could only have one set of favorites. So we need to go beyond that capability. So to create a playlist, I guess we'd like to have a name associated with the playlist and maybe a description of the playlist, and then the ability to add movies to your playlist. And it would be great if you could remove movies from a playlist and also edit the title or edit the description. But certainly adding movies to the playlist would be a minimum requirement here. And we'd like to be able to create multiple playlists for the user. The third feature I'm calling is a movie search. It would be nice if we could have a web form where the user would enter some or all of the properties that they're interested in associated with the movie. So maybe they could provide a genre, a release date, maybe a particular actor. Give me all the movies that have those characteristics. Actor might be a difficult one now, but you could certainly, it's achievable, but it may be a little bit more demanding. But take a small subset, and by small I mean maybe 5 properties of movie, and allow the user to enter data or values for each of those properties, then click a submit button, and clicking the submit will cause your React app to send a request to TMDB for a list of movies that match the criteria that has been entered on the form. And again, it's up to you to pick whatever criteria you want to. I'll talk a little bit more about how you might go about this search feature at the end of this recording. In terms of routing, whereas on the previous grade band, I said I was only looking for basic authentication. Here, if you want to get into this grade band, try and have what I'm calling more robust authentication. And if you're familiar with something like Firebase, which is an authentication service, I think Eamon might have covered that, or he may have covered an alternative to Firebase, some back-end authentication service, and you can pick up any one you want to. Firebase is by far and away the most popular one, I would say, and integrate that with your React app as an alternative to the basic authentication that we had from the previous grade band. There's lots and lots of blogs and articles online that show you how to wire up a React app with a Firebase authentication backend service. By third-party components here, I've already kind of alluded to that. There are certainly third-party components that you could use in relation to pagination. There are third-party components that would allow you to implement date pickers if entering a date is part of some feature that you develop. And you may come across other third-party components. Of course, a lot of the material UI stuff is third-party components, but you may come across other third-party components that will help you in features that you develop. And finally, if you're aiming for the top-notch 90 plus, then I'm saying that we can actually make it a full stack app. And what I'm particularly getting at there is we'd add in some persistence, some back-end persistence to our React app, where we would persist, let's say, the fantasy movies that were created, persist the playlists that were created, persist even the favorites feature that we developed in the labs, because at the moment they are not being persisted anywhere. Now, TMDB itself actually does provide some support in this area, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but as you may know, Firebase as well has a data storage part to its overall service. Don't know if you came across it when you were looking at Firebase with Eamon, if you did cover Firebase. I think it's Firestore, they call the data storage angle on Firebase. So you may already be familiar with Firestore. and that would be ideal. And it's fine to use that. Or there may be some other data storage service that you are familiar with that you could plug in as your persistence layer at the back end of your React app. So that's in terms of grading bands and what you're aiming for. That's as much information as I can give you. Now, just to go back on a few points that would have touched on, I think that the first thing you should do is go to the TMDB docs and find out a little bit more about some of the other endpoints that it has available, and then decide what features you're going to develop in your React app that will be using these endpoints. And I've already alluded to some of them, like the endpoints related to actors. There's endpoints that give you a list of movies linked to a movie. There are endpoints that tell you the full cast for a movie, endpoints that tell you what other movies an actor has played a role in, etc., etc. So browse the TMDB docs. I would say you could spend about an hour just flicking through them to see what kind of information it provides to you. So I'm giving you the link here to the docs, and that link will take you to here. And if you scroll down, on the left-hand side is where you can navigate around for all of the different endpoints. So for example, here's the discovery endpoint, and it expands out, and there's only two parts to it. This is the one that we use most often. If we go into the, just going to blow that up a little bit. If we go into the movies part, well, there's the genres part. And if it tells you exactly how to use the endpoint, if you click on that, it tells you, well, this is the URL that you use if you want to get a list of genres associated with a particular movie. And if you want to get all the genres, it's oh yeah, that is the actual endpoint, sorry. That gives you all the genres. The other one is the genres associated with TV series, which is that one there. So spend, as I say, at least an hour just prowling around the docs themselves. So what I'm showing you here in the screenshot is the actual, I'm expanding the, sorry, these are the high level endpoints, and the arrows are pointing to the high level endpoints that we used in the labs so far. So we've looked at discovery, we've used discovery in the labs, we've used genres in the labs, we've used reviews, movies, and we've used reviews. We've used all of those so far. And just by way of illustration, on the left here, I'm showing you all within the movies endpoint. There's all of these, well, I'm just going to call them sub endpoints. So there's lots and lots of other opportunities there for us to use. The dotted arrows are pointing at these sub endpoints that we've used already. So this is the one that gives us the full details on a movie. This is the one that gives us the images. The solid arrows are pointing at ones that are might be of use to you in the assignment. So this one here gives us the what it calls the cast and crew associated with a movie. Now, we wouldn't really be interested in the crew. That would be the kind of the production people, cameramen, directors, etc., etc. The cast we would be interested in. They would be the actual actors. This one here gives you, I mean, it's fairly obvious, you can read them, but it gives you a list of movies that are similar to a particular movie. This one gives you video clips associated with a movie. So you might have a little video player if that is your like. You can have a little video player modal that pops up and plays the video. Down here are some very straightforward sub endpoints, like we've used the upcoming movies endpoint, sub endpoint already, but there's a get popular endpoint that just returns 20 of the current popular movies. Top rated gives you the most popular movies of all time. So they're a bit like the discovery endpoint that we use in the labs, and also the upcoming one. So these are very straightforward to use. These are the ones that I've arrowed out. The solid arrows would require you to investigate, well, what exactly is the structure of the data that these guys return. On the right, what am I showing you? On the right, I'm showing you that part of the TMDB that contains information about, well, what it calls people, but that's really actors and crew members. And the solid arrows are just highlighting some interesting ones that you might find useful for your assignment. Down here, this one here just gives you a list of popular actors. I think popularity is they're kind of graded in some way. Moving on, for each of the sub endpoints, you obviously have to find out, well, how do I actually use that sub endpoint? And the documentation tells you once you click on the sub endpoint. So if we just go back to the browser, and if I go into, let's say, movies, well, let's pick people. And let's say I want to find out what movies a particular actor has played a role in. If I click on the sub endpoint, then here's the URL that I would use. So it's a parameterized URL. So you need to, so TMDB docs will give you the URLs that you need to use in order to access that endpoint. Now, obviously, you have to be clear about the structure of the response that comes back from an endpoint. Don't make any assumptions about that based on maybe other endpoints that you've used within TMDB. And you could use maybe Postman to help you get a handle on the structure of the response from a particular endpoint if you've used Postman or an equivalent to Postman. Or if you want to, you could actually get the component itself or a component itself to just display the structure of the data before you ever start thinking about expanding out that component to process the data. And what I'm just showing you here is if you just stick this piece of JSX as the return value of a component, then where here would be a reference to data would be a reference to the actual response object, I guess, that comes back from TMDB. The other parameters have got to do with how you want the stringify method to apply indentation and alignment to the JSON data that it displays on the screen. So you could just stick that piece of code into a component, and the component may have no other logic in it other than the logic to actually make the API call, I guess. Or as I said, just use Postman if you're familiar with Postman or an equivalent. All I'm showing you here in the screenshot is I made an API call to TMDB just using an ordinary browser where I knew what the URL would be. In this case, I think I'm requesting the movie credits associated with an actor, I think. Let me just check. So, sorry, no, what I'm getting is a list of popular actors. But the response that comes back, it's hard to read that, obviously, it's JSON. You could just then copy all of that JSON and bring up another browser tab and just do a query on JSON formatter. There are lots of online JSON formatter websites that are available, and that's what I did here. And I went to one of them, pasted in the JSON that I got here, and just clicked the format button, and then it shows me my JSON response in more legible format. So that's a bit slow, really. I would say either use Postman or just use this piece of code in a React component, and it'll display the JSON structure to you. Make sure you understand that structure before you start developing any component code around the data. That statement of the obvious, I suppose, but you'd be surprised how many people make that mistake of it, making assumptions, and then their components crash or throw up that infamous undefined error. And it's usually because you either misunderstood the structure or you're misspelling a particular key value pair within the structure. Now, one of the features I mentioned was a movie search feature. I think it was under the excellent grade band. And it turns out that TMDB provides really good support for that. Now, there is a TMDB endpoint called search on its own, but I wouldn't use that. That is fairly primitive. Maybe if I just go to the docs. You can see here, there's a search endpoint. Now, don't use that. It's very, very primitive. There's a much more sophisticated search capability available to us, and that's the one that I would suggest you should use. And it is really linked to the discovery endpoint. The screenshot here is from the discovery endpoint. And it turns out that, well, the first screenshot here is actually taken from our code. This is the API call that we make to TMDB, and it's to the discovery endpoint, as I've alluded to. But the endpoint expects a query string. In fact, most of the endpoints expect a query string. And that's what I've highlighted here in the code. Now, the first part of the query string is the same for every other endpoint. First part is where you specify your TMDB key. That's okay. It's the rest of the query string that I'm particularly interested in here. And really what the rest of the query string in relation to the discovery endpoint now, what that allows us to do is to narrow down the types of movies that we want TMDB to return to us from the discovery endpoint. Now, I've hard-coded some of them here, and I think I'm only looking for movies that are in the English language. I only want movies that are not classified as adult for obvious reasons. The third key value pair, that's not really a search criteria. That's just telling TMDB don't return any video clips with the response. So I'd leave that one out. The last property, the page property, I'll come back to, that is actually linked to pagination. So it's the language and the kind of adult rating. There are two search criteria. Now, it turns out, and I've kind of mentioning it here by way of the arrow, if you follow this arrow, there are around 32 different key value pair options that you have available to you here. Now, I clearly don't expect you to use all 32, but pick a small subset of them, 5 to 8, let's say. And the idea then is that, let's supposing the user in your implementation, you have a web form where the user can enter values for the subset of query string properties that you've selected from the many ones that are available to you. The user can enter values for them, whether that be free text values or maybe a drop-down menu, if a drop-down menu is appropriate. So for example, in the case of languages there, that was one of them. then the drop-down menu would be a better option in terms of selecting a language rather than expecting the user to enter the language as a text string. So the user fills out this form where they enter their search criteria. When they click submit on the form, what your code will do behind the scenes is it will construct this query string programmatically. And then you make the request to TMDB as before. So it's the construction of the query string plus the web form that allows the user to select or enter values for that query string properties. And the response then that comes back from TMDB will be a list of movies, and you display that list of movies. So that's how the movie search feature would work in my mind. And that's what I'd like you to have a go at if you're interested in developing the movie search feature. In terms of the pagination feature, again, the code excerpt is taken from the code that we developed in the labs, and we're again looking at the discovery endpoint here because it's one of those endpoints that returns a list of things. And the last key value pair is the page property, but I've hardwired it to a value of 1. And TMDB always returns 20 elements of whatever list you're asking it to return data on. So in this case, it would be 20 movies from the discovery endpoint. But because I've set page to 1, it's going to return the first 20 movies in its discovery endpoint. But in fact, I think it has 500 plus movies available from that endpoint. And so if I had set the page query string property to 2, then it would return the movies numbered 21 to 40, and so on and so forth. So pagination, if you implement the pagination feature, you're no longer going to be hardwiring page number here to 1. It's actually going to be a variable, and the variable value will be determined from whatever the user has selected from the pagination UI, whether that be next or the user selects a particular page number. So that's how pagination is supported in terms of how you program it. It's going to be this last page property. And again, you have to look at the relevant endpoint to see, does it support this page property? But I can tell you pretty much all of the list type endpoints do. So you could potentially have pagination in lots of different parts of your movies app. And there are also third-party pagination components that would implement the UI part. There's the UI part, and then there's the logic part. The logic part is what I'm talking about up here. The UI part, you can find the third-party pagination UI component that will render just those pagination kind of links that we're familiar with. It turns out that React Query, the caching library, it also supports pagination. So you could imagine just in relation to the discovery endpoint, and if we had pagination implemented, then let's say the user begins at page number 1 and then they click on 2. So we get page number 2 requested from TMDB, and they may request other pages from the discovery endpoint. We'd like each of those requests that went to TMDB to be cached, just in case the user goes back to a page that they've already visited. And it turns out that React Query has built-in support for pagination as well. And the 2 hyperlinks that I'm providing you with here are links to the React Query docs themselves, which I think I have actually opened up in the browser. Here's the React Query homepage. And if we go to the docs, here you can see paginated queries, and it actually gives you the code to get that running for yourselves. So you can have a read of that yourselves. So there's two parts, as I said, to pagination. There's the UI part, and you can get a third-party component to do that. And then the logic associated with it. And if you are using caching, which you should be, then you can get some assistance on the implementation of it, of the logic from the React Query docs. And thirdly, then, you need to be aware of this page property in the query string that goes as part of the endpoint request. If you are aiming for the outstanding grade band, you remember that that was characterized by having persistence backend persistence supported behind your React app. And I did mention that TMDB does provide a certain amount of, the actual TMDB website itself does provide a certain amount of support for persistence. And it's behind the lists endpoint. So if we go to the docs, so here's the list endpoint. And you can see, whereas most of the other endpoints are all GET requests, you can see that behind the list endpoint, we have post and delete request options as well, where, as we know, post means you're creating something. So the post allows us to create what TMDB calls lists. Now, a list is a list of movies. Now, where that would link into some of the requirements that I specified, the playlists, for example, would be lists of movies. So each playlist that you create, you could potentially store that playlist in terms of just the movie IDs that make up the playlist. You could store that back in the TMDB server using this part of its endpoint, list of endpoints that it makes available to us. So we can create a new list that will be creating the playlist initially. We can add to the playlist. We can remove the playlist. So you need to browse around these endpoints here to see how you could use TMDB to persist your movie lists features, whether that be playlists or favorite movies would come under that category as well. Now, you do need to formally authenticate if you want to use any of these post and delete services here. And I think if I go back to the slides, so from a programmatic point of view, you first of all have to programmatically authenticate your React app with TMDB. And I think the kind of procedure is you first of all have to get a session token from it, and then you use that session token for any of these subsequent requests that you carry out. The screenshot here is where you would go to in the docs that explains how you programmatically authenticate with TMDB, how you or your React app kind of authenticates with TMDB to get a session key, and then you use that session key to carry out these operations here. You don't need a session key if all you're doing is carrying out a GET request, but for any of the other ones, post and delete, you do need a session key because you are making changes at the back end. So you do need to read up on these two parts of the docs to get all of that working. Read up on the authentication part first. I would suggest maybe try and get that actually working so that you get a session key and console log that session key, I guess, just to make sure it's working. And then once you have the session key, you could start looking at how to get these working. That's if you decide to use TMDB for your persistence layer. If you're going to use Firebase, then clearly the stuff isn't of any relevance to you. So that's about it. Hopefully that's useful to you. And by all means, send me a message on Slack if you need some clarification on any aspect of this presentation. I will just mention one other final thing that I think I overlooked. If I go back to the grading bands. For all of the grading bands, for the first one I'm seeing, I'd like all of the following features to be achieved if you want to get to the upper level of a grading band. Similarly, for the very good, all of them should be achieved. But for this one, I'm saying most of the following would need to be achieved if you want to get at the upper level of this grade band. So for example, you might decide, I'm going to do pagination and I'm going to do playlists, but I won't bother with the movie search feature. And I'm also going to trying to hit all of this one here. So I'm just going to leave out movie search, but I'm going to try and achieve the other ones. And if you manage to do that, then I think you're at the upper level of this grade band. Or you may decide, I won't do playlists. I'm just going to do the movie search, pagination, and the robust authentication. And you're also at the upper level. The other point I want to make is, you may decide, I'm not going to tackle any of these here, but because I do know about Firebase's persistence support, I'm actually going to try and use that to store my fantasy movies, where fantasy movies was back in the very good grade band. I will still award marks to you for achieving the persistence stuff, even though you didn't tackle any of the aspects of the lower grade band, immediately lower grade band. In other words, everything that you do will get marks awarded to it. And you need to ensure that you document everything in the README associated with the GitHub repo, but I will give you an exact template for the README that needs to accompany your GitHub repo. And it's very important that you follow that template. But again, I'll provide that template closer to the deadline date. Okay, bye for now.